when somebody is trying to do the work on themselves, I think the danger that I see a lot of people falling into in our culture is to just place all of the blame on their parents or on their upbringing. And part of that process of true healing is being able to kind of extend grace to the imperfect people in your life while also not excusing the poor behavior. And it's just a really difficult and tricky topic to navigate. And I see people that I respect taking various angles into it. And so I'm wondering if you can kind of just kick us off with some of your thoughts there.
Yeah. Well, I see people getting stuck in that conversation pretty commonly on where do I put the blame? And that seems to be where all the arguments are about too. It's just like, is it my mom's fault that I feel this way? Is it my dad's fault? Is it my fault? Is it just because I'm weak? Like, you know, it's not always obvious if we've been through trauma. Just because you don't maybe have like PTSD symptoms doesn't mean you haven't experienced something overwhelming in your life. Like all trauma is something that was so overwhelming that you didn't really have any resources or any ability to like cope with it in the moment. So you either just kind of like shut it down, or it resulted in a bunch of hypervigilance and anxiety. And then the thing about traumatic responses, even just in a moment, is they often kind of turn into these loops and these cycles that self-reinforce, And so, for example, like if I get bullied, in fourth grade, even if it wasn't like deep harassment, I wasn't getting like concussions and stuff, or, humiliated in front of everyone, but it was just like one relationship that was really important to me. Maybe we were really good friends, and then it really went sour and they became just really hostile. And let's say I really took that to heart, like that really affected me. I might come away from that experience with something like, I'm just not cool enough to hang out with, or I'm just not, like maybe in the circumstance, the friend like moved on and like made another friend and you became less important. So it's just like, oh, okay, I'm not very important. I'm just not really worth hanging out with. I'm the second choice. And then that narrative sticks in your mind and actually just kind of starts to reprogram the way you interact socially with other people. And you just kind of carry that in. I'm second choice. And then that continues on. And then even in your friendships, you're always trying to kind of overcompensate. You're trying to be extra funny, extra likable, extra accommodating, which some of those behaviors just end up kind of, I don't know, reinforcing people, keeping you at an arm's length because you're not necessarily being honest or trying to manipulate the situation. They can kind of sniff that you're, kind of coming at it from a place of insecurity, of nervousness, and that just,
Mm,
they wouldn't articulate it that way, but that's just a little bit off-putting. And
yeah.
then they put you at a distance, and then that reinforces, yep, I'm at second choice. I'm second choice. And then that just kind of spirals. So that's like a low resolution, or not low resolution, low, you could call that, some people call that like a lowercase t trauma. Like, so that's not the same as, going through a rape or something, but it affects you. It affects you in the sense that it was overwhelming to go through. You were in fourth grade. You didn't know how to like think through that. And then it creates a reinforcing cycle of behavior, which kind of, makes the trauma oscillate out of control and then turns into a lot of social anxiety. Now, the reality is like, we don't just go through one of those experiences. We go through a constellation of them. So it's like, it's not just that, bullying event when you're in fourth grade. It's also kind of the emotionally cold relationship you had with your dad. And he was just overwhelmed at work, but you didn't know that. You're a kid. And so you just think he's disinterested in you. And
Mm.
so, you feel like your second choice to your dad. You feel like, your second choice to your older brother. You feel like your second choice at school. And then you try to get into the university that you want to, you don't get in. And the thought that comes up for you isn't, oh, maybe I should have worked on my, essays a little more, or maybe some extracurricular stuff like might have helped, or, there's another school that would have been fine. Your thought is, yep, that makes sense because I just am never first choice. And that reinforcing narrative starts to create problems of its own. And that's what makes this whole blame thing tricky, because it's like, well, is it my fault? Is it my dad's fault for not, noticing me more? Is it that kid Billy's fault from fourth grade? It's like, well, it's kind of all of it. Like most complex things aren't just one thing. It's like 7, 8, 20 things. Like, I don't know. And so process of healing from that trauma is kind of untangling that knot, and that happens one knot at a time, and you kind of go back through the thread untangling those knots. And for some of those things, it had to do with your dad. For some of it had to do with Billy. For some of it, it was that you were acting in a way that pushed people off, and that you need to take some responsibility for that, and then kind of change your own behavior.
Yeah.
And easy to let the conversation kind of get trapped in these single buckets of like, I'm just a worthless piece of garbage. Like, oh, my dad, he never loved me, he was abusive, or, you know, society, whatever. But it's often a whole range, you know, a constellation. That's the word I like the most, a
Constellation.
constellation.
Yeah.
But that's, again, referencing some lowercase t or lowercase t trauma kind of stuff. I would say that that whole system is still valid. It's just kind of larger and more complex when we start to mix in really, you know, deep traumas like chronic sexual abuse, physical trauma, having a dad who was an alcoholic, you know, having a family member who was in prison, you know, growing up with a single mom and just having kind of a rotating door full of guys that were coming in your life and out, some of them more damaging than others. You could
Yeah.
imagine if it's that complex on something like bullying and an emotionally cold dad. And I'm not saying that's not important. I'm just saying there's more complexity to something like chronic rape. You can imagine with something highly complex like that, how that system just kind of goes out of control. It can kind of oscillate into all sorts of complex territory. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, the process of healing there is untangling. And in my philosophy is then actually getting to the root, getting to the heart of it and healing those traumatic wounds, not just kind of learning how I can change my behavior, learning, you know, hey, I shouldn't be socially anxious, or kind of going on a tirade against dad, or, you know, it's actually going in and emotionally healing that stuff. That's what really makes a difference. That's my point of view.
Which is a long-term process. It's not like, I think a lot of the stuff that you see online is people sharing what they learned in their first like 2 therapy sessions, and then they're like, now I got the answer, and you're like, yeah, that's not really how the human psyche works. It's a little bit more complex than that.
It makes sense to me though. I mean, at least a part of them felt validated, maybe for the first time, you know.
Yeah.
So it's
Well, it's like the first
something
line of sight where it's like it's all been a fog so far. And then for the first time in their life, they see something in the fog and they're like, that's it.
exactly.
You're like, that's not this is an archipelago or the constellation, whatever you want to say. Like, there's a lot of things to discover in the fog. The more you dig, the more you realize, oh yeah, there's a lot of stuff here.
Yeah, that's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. That's super good. So you kind of touched on something and didn't say it explicitly, but you and I have talked about this offline, that trauma it's not just about what's happened to you. It's also about things that you didn't receive. It's also about things that didn't happen to you that you don't realize that you're lacking or that you were lacking. And so you've spent a lot of your adulthood trying to fill a void that you didn't get from your childhood. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Yeah. I talk to people a lot where they're like, I kind of have all these symptoms that kind of look like trauma. Like, I feel really
But I never was raped, or I never,
yeah,
yeah.
I never really want anything. I had a happy childhood, you know, and I think things were generally pretty good, but I'm like anxious, or I'm like, you know, I have all these intrusive thoughts. Like I'm paranoid all the time. I can't sleep. I feel super depressed. I don't feel motivated. And I have like, and maybe it's like you have an addiction. Maybe it's something like more socially appropriate addiction wise, like you overeat and you just can't get like a hold of it. Or you know, I look at porn and I can't stop. And it's like, what? I don't know. I don't have any memories of anything bad happening. And something that I point out for some clients, and this isn't applicable for every context, but just something maybe to log away and think about is sometimes the trauma is more about what didn't happen versus what did happen. Like maybe the trauma is that you didn't have memories of your mom, you know, coming towards you with warm physical touch and cuddling up with her, and that you were left to deal with your overwhelm on your own.
Yeah.
You were left to deal with, you know, running into failure and not knowing how to grapple with it. And so instead of a father stepping in and being like, let me encourage you, let me show you how to problem solve it, let's break it down. This isn't failing at this doesn't mean you're something lower quality. It doesn't mean that you're insufficient. It means your strategy was insufficient.
Yeah.
Your strategy needs dialing in, not that you're insufficient. That's not an obvious connection to make. That's something I think a responsibility of a father is to instill that lesson in particular, among others. But like, we didn't have that in some cases. We didn't have that encouragement. We didn't have wisdom passed down to show us and to teach us. And so we had to figure it out on our own. And just through the process of trial and error, that was really overwhelming. And so some of the traumas we have are the memories we don't have that we should have had. And that is so much more difficult actually to pin down in therapy. Neglect is far more troublesome to, especially at the beginning, to get down to and start the healing process of than like overt volatile abuse. Because at least with volatile abuse, you have some sort of memories, unless it was so severe that you blocked it out. That's a whole different kind of thing. But at least, with a really critical mom, you can kind of pinpoint it and be like, yeah, it was her always making fun of me. That really makes sense why I feel this way. But when it's silence, and everything is just about maintaining the family image, and your thoughts, feelings, emotions, what you needed in that moment was just subtly kind of just pushed aside, not batted away, just shift aside.
Yeah.
Gosh, you just feel like this is just me. Something's wrong with me, because everything else looks like it's just completely clean cut and fine and everything's fitting into place. And then here I am, just like a mess for no good reason. I must just be insufficient, weak, pathetic, a loser.
Yeah.
Um, Something's just wrong with me. And then
Yeah.
you can't remember anything bad happening. Yeah, you spiral into self-criticism.
Why is it that some people that don't have the support uh become very self-sufficient and almost become somebody that is more healthy and more in touch with themselves and reality and the reality around them than others? And
Yeah.
some that don't have the support just kind of they feel like they're lost in the fog and they just kind of their wheels spin.
Well, there's two answers to this question, two schools of thought academically, because what you're talking about there is adjacent to the question of something called post-traumatic growth. There's this whole conversation on that. There's libraries written on that. There's libraries written on like what makes the difference. And here's something to keep in mind. Like, okay, so for example, you have the 9/11 first responders. There were studies done on them, that they're really well studied group of people, because you have these, EMTs and firemen pulling bodies out of the wreckage. It's a highly traumatic experience, no matter what. If you were there in New York, like it was just traumatic. So they watched and saw who developed PTSD and who didn't. And they did 6-month follow-up, 2-year follow-ups. And it was interesting. The people that developed PTSD, you had something like, I don't want to cite it incorrectly, so maybe I can send you the study later, and maybe you can include it in an email or something to the group. But
Yeah.
because I want to, right? But to my memory, forgive me if this is wrong, but it was something like 60% higher likelihood of developing PTSD if you've had a traumatic experience before, earlier in your life. So if you went through, for example, like a parent who went to prison, a dad who was an alcoholic or something as a kid, you had a 60% higher likelihood that 9/11 resulted in PTSD. And
Interesting.
so that was really informative, because what that taught us is that PTSD has this like stacking effect, like
Compounding. Yeah.
not just the intensity of the experience, and it's not just like, there's a lot of studies into like grit. That's kind of like the word. your grit as a person, like, are you really resilient? Can you like stand up underneath a lot of suffering, or do you kind of fold easy? That study was all kind of called into question a little bit, because it was it was evident that it's not just single experiences and how people stand
Yeah.
up experiences, it's someone's whole history. And
Yeah.
then once you start comparing that, it's like, how do you compare one person's constellation of hard things they've been through another? And then the other side of the coin of that conversation is someone's personality. And some people,
Yeah.
just by genetic, the genetic lottery of who, who conceived you, have more or less of a temperament that is sensitive to the outside world. And that's not the same thing as some people are just like weaker than other people. I think
That'd
of
be
it like,
neuroticism.
yeah, neuroticism, it's
Link
sensitivity.
to it at least.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can think about it like it's trait neuroticism. That's a little bit of what I'm thinking of. I'm also thinking of just trait conscientiousness. That's another, important personality dimension, when thinking about that. It's Gabor Mate said it really well. He's like, if you had a burn on your shoulder, and then someone, let's say you weren't wearing a shirt, someone kind of tapped your shoulder on that burn, you would experience searing pain because of the wound, because of the sensitivity, versus, if on your other shoulder you didn't have a burn there and someone tapped it, you wouldn't experience pain. So we can't just measure the severity of the pressure of the tap. We also need to ask the question, what's the sensitivity of the nerves that are, exposed in the case of
Yeah.
like a burn? And
I
what
almost
that
wonder too if there's a layer of, because I'm really convinced that the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we believe about the world just kind of shapes almost everything about the way that we engage. And so I almost wonder if there's like a validating of a story. And you kind of touched on that with your example of the bullying, where it's like you have this belief and then you have another experience and then it validates and it loops, where there's kind of there's this underlying story that might be buried in your subconscious that is, the world is unsafe and I'm unsafe,
yeah.
and chaos could strike at any point, and that's actually something that there's no hope there. And when you have another experience, and maybe consciously you're thinking there's a lot of hope. And then when you have another traumatic experience, there's like the subconscious part of you goes, oh, you thought there was hope?
Mhm.
Like I'm just going to prove you wrong based on this experience right now. There's no hope. And then it's like, then you're spiraling.
Mm. Yeah, well said. I mean, and then the question is, why do some stories reach out to us more than others? And
Yeah.
then that's kind of the chicken or the egg thing with personality. Like,
Yeah.
I'm a really creative person, and so, there's certain kinds of beauty that reach out to me in the world and inspire me versus someone who's more pragmatic and conscientious that might not attach to the same thing. I wonder if there's similar things when it comes to the stories that we attach to, the
Yeah.
loops we get trapped in.
Yeah.
Know the
Well, this
answers.
is why we start the hero journey program doing a ton of work on yourself. I mean, we
Yeah.
spent 4 weeks essentially unpacking your individual call, your personality, your identity, all that stuff, like going through the belly of the whale to kind of get to that point where you're coming to your obstacles and your journey, your path from a place of having a better understanding of yourself than when you started. Because
Mm.
I'm operating under the premise that the more that you know yourself and the more that you understand what the stories are that you are telling about yourself and about the world and about God, the more that you have clarity on those things,
Mhm.
the better you can navigate through the obstacles of the road and the opportunities of the road as well.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So let me ask you a question that I think I'm coming at this conversation with a heavy dose of irony with the fact that we're recording a 30-minute conversation and the topics that we're touching on are things that you'll work through for years, if not decades, if not for the rest of your life, probably for the rest of your life to a large degree, and that you'll spend countless hours with clients on. So with that caveat being said, what are some tools that people can use to begin to identify parts of the constellation that made up their world when they were growing up and that are still informing their world now, whether or not they know it?
That's a great question. Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is it's really helpful to identify the intersections of your inner conflict. When you have an internal conflict, you have two parts of you that are running in opposite directions that want to solve perhaps the same problem in two different ways. And that is always ripe territory for introspection and interest because no doubt those parts have a story and there's something informing the intensity by which they're holding to their strategy. So for example, like pornography, it's like a part of you wants to stop looking at porn, feels really guilty about it, feels terrible, shameful, you feel disgusting, you feel like, God's angry at you, you're mad at yourself. I mean, good grief, much less who else is angry at you. And then you have another part of you that, I mean, if you were being honest, if you really let them speak and say it the way they would want to say it, you'd be like, I don't feel normal unless this is a part of my life. Like I feel relaxed, I feel at ease, I feel okay. At least for a few moments, I feel okay. Like everything else feels overwhelming. Everything else feels dismal. Everything else feels painful and fatiguing. And then for like 10 minutes, an hour, however long, it's like I feel okay and I feel interested and I feel engaged.
Hmm.
And we shame that, right? That's our first thing. It's just like, well, that's flesh. That's not the man I want to be. That's old self. That's that's something I need to cut out. And then the question I usually ask in therapy is just like, what problem is that part of you trying to fix?
Yeah. Yeah.
What about the overwhelm and the fatigue? Does the other party have an appreciation for that? The part that wants to stop looking at porn? Like, do they acknowledge how much stress and how overwhelmed and how lonely or, whatever that porn is fixing? Do you have a clear understanding of what it's fixing? And then do you have a does the other party have a clear understanding of that too? Likely not. The other party is just like, well, this isn't the right solution. It's like, fine. Well, what is a good solution? Well, I can go on a walk. I can call a friend. I can get rid of my smartphone. And it's like, yeah, those are usually strategies to stop the behavior, not to nurture the thing that's starving in you,
Yeah.
that at least gets a bit of satiation when you're doing the behavior that is immoral or wrong.
Yeah.
You need a complex understanding of that. That's not obvious. It's not obvious to you, much less your therapist, what is underneath of that. And that could take a year to get underneath of. And and the experiences, the constellation of events underneath of that that are upregulating you. Who knows? You could have, undiagnosed adult ADHD, and your dopamine receptors do not fire well, and so everything feels overwhelming to you. You feel fatigued and irritated all the time, even if there's nothing stressful going on in your life. And the pornography boosts up your dopamine in a really good way, and so you feel normal and settled. And that doesn't have anything to do with the trauma. That's just because you just need some like Adderall or Ritalin or something, and you find that resisting porn is actually pretty easy because you don't need it to do the thing that you needed it to do, because your executive functions are firing away. Like you have full capacity over your frontal cortex. It's doing what it needs to do. And so that could take years to figure out. It might not be that simple. It might be that you had experiences as a kid that, if you're being totally honest, were not safe for you. And whether that was another kid doing things or another adult, that you've just blocked that out and you just don't want to think about it. And you have no idea that subconsciously that stuff is really deeply affecting your porn addiction. And you can beat yourself up for like being just this, pathetic, inconsistent loser. Or you can realize that there's a younger part of you that's really trying to be seen, and is being seen through the pornography, even in an unhealthy way. And until you learn how to see that part of you in a healthy way and nurture that part isn't going to loosen its grip on the pornography. And you can shame it all you want. It's actually going to, I don't know, just intensify the depression you feel after. That's really all it's going to do.
Yeah.
So it's complex. There's a million different things. So I started the intersections of inner conflict. What comes to mind for you though, Ian?
Well, I mean, we've done in the past, I've done the genogram.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a great one. Yeah.
Yeah. And that, like, I think that we're going to probably go through that as a cohort. I'm kind of on the fence about doing that or not, but I think we're going to do that, or at least a modified version of that in this course. But being able to kind of unpack, I think being able, I don't want to move on before touching on what you just said. Just pause what I was about to say. I love what you're saying, and that's actually something that we've touched on a bunch in this program, and that we're the next week we're actually heading into the shadow, which is I'm really excited about that. But I think
that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, the underlying premise there is to approach the various parts of yourself with a sense of curiosity and an openness to find the value in even the things that we think are the most worthy of shame and repression and rejection. And I think that there's something there that my pathway into this line of thought really long ago, I think in high school, was C.S. Lewis, just talking about the desires and about how like every desire, even if it's our worst desires, actually there is a good desire there that has been corrupted. And so instead of just repressing that urge, by repressing your urge for pornography, what you're doing is you are condemning yourself to never find the redemption of that desire. And so you're going to be battling that urge in the dark, where it's gaining all kinds of strength.
Yeah.
And you're not
the right thing.
Yeah.
That's the real tragedy of it, is like you think you're doing it right. You think you're honoring God, and you're actually, tying your hands behind your back.
Yep.
It's interesting you bring up Lewis there, because I've always thought this, like, we don't have any indication that Lewis read anything from Carl Jung, but they read all the same stories. They read all the same myths. They're both, avid lovers of mythology. And so they came to some of those same conclusions. I think just because that's what happens when you read stories over thousands of years and, tons of different cultures, is you see that same principle. Like in the Arthurian stories, you've probably already referenced this. It's such a good story, but it's like when the knights were around the king table and the quest of the Holy Grail came up, it was, the King Arthur looked at each of his knights and said, "Go to the part of the forest that looks densest to you."
Yeah, and darkest.
And start looking there, right? Because the Holy Grail represented transformation. It was the entity that could transform and not just transform you, but transform the culture. And so it's like,
redeem.
Okay, where do you look for the thing that can transform? Start in the place that's darkest, that's thickest, the place you least want to go, the place that looks the most troublesome. Start looking.
The most dangerous. Yeah.
Tremendous.
Yeah. That's such a great insight. I love that insight. And that's essentially the quest that we're on right now. And the reason that we're framing this whole thing through the hero's journey is because I believe in the truth of that metaphor. I think that that's exactly right. And I mean, we've covered that in a bunch of different ways through different angles in this course so far, and we're going to keep doing that over the next couple of weeks. But yeah, I love that you brought that up.
One other thing that just occurred is like that's the story of the cross in some ways too. Like Jesus went to the darkest place, and the transformation of mankind happened on the cross. Like it happened on the darkest,
Yeah,
deepest, painful, evil,
yeah. Well,
unjust.
the idea that I've gotten from Peterson is like it's you are if you are meant to be a redemptive force, then redeeming a small space, like he says clean your room, like that is acting out the process of redemption on the smallest scale that you could kind of possibly imagine. I mean, I guess you could go organize your cell phone, whatever, but like clean up your room, like start small, and then as you grow, like you continue to expand your sphere of responsibility that you are taking on to redeem. And I think that so he talks about Christ as the ultimate example of taking on the most redemption. And so the bigger the bigger the objective of redemption it is, the darker and the harder the obstacle is going to be. And I think that that's why like Christ is actually the perfect example of the archetypical hero's journey. I mean, it doesn't get more archetypical than him, and that's part of why his story has stuck so well, because it's fundamentally the truest and the best example that we've ever had.
Yeah, that's what makes Peterson scratch his head.
Yeah,
That's why he's almost a Christian. He's so close because he's like,
yeah,
what if Christ was the personification of the hero? Like
yeah.
he knows enough mythology to know it's just there's too many things lining up in Christ.
Well,
For that.
and also, if every story that's ever been told that was like an amazing story is just a mirror of that story, then you're kind of like, yeah, yeah.
That's right.
There's a reason why it all is echoing back to the center of reality there. Yeah. So
Yeah.
so yeah, so I think that all of that being said, I love that line of examining the intersection of your internal conflict. Is that the way that you said it?
Yeah, that's right.
That's super good. And then just kind of going at that with a sense of openness and curiosity. And I'm really stressing like the redemption. Like I don't hear a lot of people talking about redemption today in modern psychology, and it's kind of a Christian word and it's kind of a spiritual word, and I think that's probably part of why people don't really use it that much, but we're using it a lot on this journey. It's this idea that you're not just going on a journey to become stronger or more empowered. That those are byproducts of the process, but the process that we're going after is a process of redemption. It's transformation, but transformation could be anything. I think redemption really is kind of the underlying thing that we're after here. Is we're going on a journey of adventure and purpose and calling, and that adventure and that purpose and that calling are all in the direction of redemption for yourself, for your family, for your community, for the world at large. And so yeah, I think that that's, if you can kind of examine the areas of your internal conflict with this idea of redemption, and that's where we're going next week with the shadow. So I love that a lot. To answer your question from like 10 minutes ago, we're talking about the genogram, we're talking about kind of understanding the people in your lives as their own flawed humans. And I think there's a massive amount of power and in approaching the people in your life with that grace. That my dad was struggling financially, struggling at work, felt alone, didn't have friends, just the list could go on of the things that he was struggling with. So the things that he did to me that I wish he hadn't done, or the things that he didn't do that I wish he had done, all of that, it's not to excuse any of that, but it's just to contextualize it in a story that's not 100% directed to me and about me. It's actually he had his own story going on, and so kind of being able to unpack what
Yeah,
story other people were in that I interpreted at the time as a statement about me and my value and my worth.
that's right. Yeah. Well, and I'll even close maybe with this idea. It's like, I worked for the first year as a therapist. I worked in a state kind of uh, agency that worked with kids who had problematic sexual behavior, which means that kids that sexually, aggress other kids.
Mm.
And it was a really intense job, so, all day, 40 hours a week, whatever. I was working with kids, not just who were victims of abuse, but that perpetrated abuse. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't call perpetrators when they're kids, because they don't really know what they're doing, but it was a really intense setting. And the question that comes to mind immediately, like when you start working with those kids, as all of us were interns, like in our first supervision meeting, is like, why would a kid do that? Like,
Mm.
what motivates somebody to rape someone, or like, become violent towards someone, or manipulate someone, or, whatever. Uh, and, the answer, I think, was really like a paradigm shift for me, because you think, it was explained to me by a 10-year-old kid, to be honest, that the kid taught me this, but it was like, man, when whatever happened to me happened, because all those kids that act out in that way have some sort of sexual trauma history. Whenever what happened to me is like, I was the one who was a victim. I was the one who wasn't in control. And I
Mm.
just once wanted to feel like I was in control.
Mm. Yeah.
And if you pay attention to how those things line up, there's something really powerful there. So in their experience, where they were victimized, where they were traumatized, they were out of control, they were the victim, they were subjected to someone else's power. And then when they acted out in a way that was harmful towards someone else, they did it motivated out of a desire to feel in control, to feel powerful, to feel agency. And
Yeah.
it had to feel similar to the thing that they went through. And so then you asked the question, was like, well, how do you treat someone like that? How do you help a kid who's doing something like that? What would you even start to say in a therapy session? And it's a quest, a lot of like what you're saying. Because if you don't go on the hero's journey, you will enact the trauma down the road.
Yeah.
There will be parts of you that are desiring, what I call it psychologically, is a corrective experience. Redemption, is a great word for it. It's there's parts of you that are looking for a corrective experience, that are looking for redemption. And if you don't do it in the light, they will do it in the shadow.
Yep.
And that's a really extreme example, right? With like sexual assault, but I'm talking in even smaller ways. There will be times when the volatility that you experienced will be something that comes through you onto other people, unless you resolve it, unless you master it in your own heart. And by
Yeah.
master it, I don't mean control it and stuff it away and fit it in the box you want it to look like. I mean heal it,
Yeah.
nurture it, and give that young part of you that's still acting in there what it needed, that your mom should have given, that your dad should have given, that your church should have given, whatever it needs. It's a process of nourishment that needs to happen. And
Yeah.
then ultimately release of a burden that doesn't belong to you. And that burden can look like a narrative that you've believed, a thing that you believed about yourself that wasn't true. It can look like a behavior that needs to shift and change. That's the journey, in
Yeah.
part.
That's so good. All right, we're at time, so I'm gonna go. I'm gonna let you go because I know you've got a TikTok to run. Speaking of which, how do people connect with you? I know that we mentioned at the top you've got some really awesome resources that are really helpful for people. So maybe just share how the best way to get connected with you and
Sure. Yeah. Matthias J Barker on everything. Matthias J Barker on Instagram or TikTok or my website. Yeah, reach out to me there. Send me a DM. Tell me you're from Heroes Journey.
what are some of the resources that you have that might be helpful to guys that are listening?
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of different trauma workshops where I kind of break down, if anything I'm talking about like clicks for you. I have like a whole kind of curriculum where I kind of break down, healing from trauma.
Would you
And I
call it a constellation of curriculum?
haha, nice one. And well, and it's cool because there's workbooks, involved as well. And not just myself. I have actually a course with some of the leading trauma experts, kind of in the field right now that I have one that I've made. I have another one I'm working on right now. So there's some with just me that are kind of cheaper. There's kind of a more expansive course for people that want something like that. But that's really kind of been part of my mission online, is creating tangible, kind of self-paced, tools for doing this work, not just talking about it.
Yeah, so good. Dude, thank you so much for your time. You're such a blessing to my life as a person and as a friend and as a man, and just a huge blessing to this course. I know this conversation is going to spark a lot of new lines of inquiry in the guys, and hopefully they end up heading over and taking some of your workshops as well. And
Thank
if
you.
they don't follow you already, just a delightful follow with an amazing background on all of the videos. So great.
Ian, I'm really thankful for you as well. This is this is really something that's needed. I think our conversations have been that you started Hero's Journey because this was something tangibly needed in our culture that really hasn't been established in a strong way yet. And I think that you're the man for the job. I really trust you and love you as a friend. I've been so enriched by you. And so this, of course, is a joy to get to do with you. I'm excited for everyone who's watching that they get to go on this journey with you. You're a trustworthy companion for it. So thanks for including me.
Appreciate it. All right. We'll talk soon.
It's wonderful. Can't lose. You hear that music?